Hi, I'm Danny Bowles, and I'll be reading from Eckhart new novel Spitzweg in my sample translation. Chapter 1, Genuine and Fake. I never cared much for art. Most of the pictures I laid eyes on I thought either unsightly or vacuous. At times, even both at once. How did artists ever come up with the notion that the world ought to be interested in what they put to paper? Paintings as such, what's their point? Before I hang a landscape on the wall, I'd much prefer to look out the window at one, and if I should feel like seeing a human being, I'll install a mirror then and there. Often art tries to be both, window and mirror, and yet can supplant neither one nor the other. The very moment it attempts to depict life realistically is when the magnitude of its failure becomes especially obvious. This was made clear to me by an incredible event at school, and it required the persuasive powers of an existence whose origins lay solely in art to convince me of the opposite. The miracle of art in its ability to vividly encapsulate a vision of truth in aesthetic form. Seen in this light, I can hardly interpret Karl's appearance among us only shortly before the day on which this story occurred as coincidence. Our art teacher tasked us with drawing a self-portrait, and as ever, the majority, myself included, once more gave nothing but bumbling proof of its ineptitude. And so as everyone crouched in despair over their sketch pads while trying at least to get the contours of their faces down halfway right, Frau Hügel, her hands clasped behind her back, slinked from table to table as we were accustomed to her doing. Her severe black ensemble, from which she only seldom deviated, consisted of a finely woven turtleneck sweater with a pleated skirt. Her greasily dark hair was pulled back at the sides, but a glistening strand always fell forward whenever she leaned over a pupil's shoulder to better scrutinize his work, as she also did with Kirsten, the only one among us possessing talent. With marked exactitude, she examined the already near-perfect drawing, then cleared her throat at length, and in a flat voice finally issued her verdict. A real triumph. My respect, the audacity for ugliness. Kirsten gulped into the silence that immediately descended. After an excruciatingly prolonged pause during which we all stared at her as if petrified, she stood up and ran out the rear of the art studio, her hands covering her face, into the stone stairwell. And although Kirsten had not raised her daintily high-squeaking voice, to this day I hear her mute cry blanketing the ever more distant echoes of her shoes clacking on the landing. Like everyone else, Frau Hügel gaped at the door in the back of the room after the vanished Kirsten, completely gobsmacked. Because I was the only person sitting in the row right in front of her, no one else witnessed the incredible thing that took place in the meantime. Karl, whose seat in art was next to Kirsten's, was looking toward the door, just as all the other school children. At the same time, however, with arm outstretched, he was slipping his sketch pad very slowly over top Kirsten's portrait, almost soundlessly, until his covered hers entirely. To this day, I do not know why this movement of his automatically reminded me of the moon's shadow sliding across the sun during an eclipse. But I instantly held my breath, in the fear that my exhalation might give him away. Although until this point in time I had been rather skeptical of the new boy, as most everyone called him, I felt something akin to forced complicity binding us together from this moment on. It grew with each millimeter the sketch pad, now with Kirsten's portrait underneath it, wandered back toward Karl before inconspicuously coming to rest in front of him. Karl was different. He didn't speak with any of us. The first and only sentence I'd heard from him outside class was uttered in the courtyard shortly before the end of recess at the vending machine. He was in front of me in line, and after inserting his coins had looked at the drink selection with mild indecision and boredom before finally pressing the cancel button and slipping the change back into his pants pocket. All the while I must have stared at him a bit too blatantly. At any rate, he snapped his fingers in the air as if calling me out of a trance like a magician. Then he flashed a pained smile at me and with an apologetic shrug said, "I favor milk. That is obviously lacking here, as so much else," about which he was more than correct. "That's not how I meant it at all," Frau Hügel muttered into the oppressive quiet of the room, though more to herself, while shaking her head. Just when I was about to say something in Kirsten's defense, my gaze touched upon Karl, who'd raised an eyebrow and was looking straight into my eyes. His thumb drew an imaginary zipper shut over his mouth, Then he bared his teeth for a fraction of a second and immediately assumed his usual pose again, emphatically impassive earnestness. After the tacitly sealed accord about the secret we shared, I found it difficult to conceal my disappointment at the fact that he could have actually contemplated I would betray him. My pride was wounded, even though we hardly knew one another, and he thus had every reason not to place blind trust in me. Yet I was certain he had acted in the knowledge that I was carefully observing him during the deed. I couldn't help but watch him deftly take possession of the drawing. He had, to some extent unsolicited, forced me to become an eyewitness to his coup and thereby to assume at once a tidy share of the blame. Because it all happened right before my eyes, moreover, he must have felt the utmost satisfaction throughout the whole initiative at being able to count on my absolute and undivided attention with each minuscule movement, all the while without so much as even glancing at me a single time. I'm not sure what would have happened if I'd simply ignored Carl's telling motion for silence at that critical moment in the art studio and had raised my voice for Kirsten, exactly in the manner my moral nature had urged me to, as a barely suppressible impulse. But I will never know. Whether someone would have stood up with me then and run after her to stop her, whether we would have caught up to her outside the school only to clutch her by both arms in an almost cinematic scene, to shake her, look her directly in the eyes, and persuade her that everything wasn't so bad and had only been a misunderstanding, to convince her to come back with us to the lesson. Yet who knows? Carl would surely have turned his back on me right then. Inevitable. The fact that a loss had to be registered.